Title: The Shadow on Floor 5 Part 1. Eva's breath fogged up the glass as she peered through the window of the taxi, the bright lights of the city blurring into streaks of neon as they passed by. Moving to a new city always carried a mix of excitement and anxiety, but tonight, the latter seemed to dominate. The taxi pulled up to an old brick building, its facade scarred by time, nestled between two newer high-rises. 39 Redwood, ma'am, the driver announced, his voice jolting Eva from her reverie. She stepped out into the chill of the night, her suitcase in hand, looking up at what was to be her new home. The apartment building had a certain faded charm, its name, Elmwood Heights, barely visible on a rusted iron sign swinging above the entrance. Eva entered the dimly lit lobby, the air stale with the scent of old wood and mothballs. The landlord, Mr. Gregor, was an odd, wiry man with a nervous twitch in his left eye. He greeted Eva with a toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to Elmwood Heights, miss." "Eva." "Eva Langley," she replied, forcing a smile. "Ah, yes. Apartment 5B. It's one of our best," Mr. Gregor exclaimed, his voice echoing slightly in the empty lobby. He handed her the keys, his cold fingers brushing against hers, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. The elevator was an ancient contraption, its brass gates creaking ominously as Eva stepped inside. She pressed the button for the 5th floor, the gears groaning in protest as the lift shuddered upwards. The hallway of the 5th floor was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. Apartment 5B was at the far end of the corridor. As Eva unlocked the door and pushed it open, a musty smell greeted her. The apartment was furnished with pieces that looked as if they were from another era. Heavy, dark drapes covered the windows, and the faint glow of the streetlights outside barely illuminated the room. Tired from her journey, Eva decided to explore the rest of the apartment in the morning and collapsed onto the surprisingly comfortable bed. Her dreams that night were restless, filled with whispers and soft, skittering sounds that seemed to echo through the vast, empty halls of Elmwood Heights. She woke to the sound of something scratching at her door. Sitting up in bed, she listened intently. Silence. She chalked it up to her imagination, a side effect of the stress from her move. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and organizing. Eva met a few of her neighbors, all of whom seemed pleasant enough, though no one stayed in conversation for long. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a collective unease that no one dared to acknowledge. One evening, as Eva returned from a walk, she noticed the door to apartment 5A ajar. Curiosity piqued, she peered inside. The apartment was empty, the walls marked with strange, dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. She jumped when she heard a voice behind her. "Curious about old 5A, are ya?" It was an elderly woman, her back bent, leaning heavily on a cane. Eva stepped back, startled. I was just, that's Mary's place." Or was. "Poor thing disappeared about a week ago. Just up and vanished. They say this floor's cursed, you know," the woman whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Eva's heart raced. "Disappeared?" The woman nodded, leaning in closer. "They never stay long in 5A. Bad things happen. You best be careful, girl. This building, it's old, has secrets. Dark ones." That night, Eva lay in bed, her mind racing. The scratching at her door returned, louder this time, more insistent. Fear gripped her as she crept towards the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She opened it a crack, and the hallway was empty. But the scratching continued, now seeming to come from within the walls. Over the next few days, Eva's unease grew. Objects in her apartment moved inexplicably. She heard whispers, felt cold drafts pass through rooms with closed windows. Her neighbors' behavior grew more erratic, their glances more paranoid. One night, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eva ventured down to the building's basement, a place Mr. Gregor had offhandedly mentioned but advised against visiting. The air was thick with dust, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the end of the corridor. There, behind an old, rusted door, she found it, a room filled with old newspapers, articles about the Part 2, Elmwood Heights' dark past was laid bare in those faded newspapers, the headlines screaming of tragedy and horror that had occurred over the decades. Mysterious disappearances at Elmwood Heights, one headline declared. Another read, unsolved murders plague local apartment complex. Eva's hands trembled as she leafed through the papers, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls around her. The stories detailed various tenants who had vanished without a trace, their belongings left behind, doors locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just an empty apartment and a lingering sense of dread. Others spoke of gruesome deaths, bodies discovered in horrific states, with wounds that no human could inflict. As Eva dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Every incident occurred in the apartments surrounding hers, especially apartment 5A. A cold realization washed over her, the apartment she had looked into, the one belonging to the missing Mary. Each article hinted at supernatural causes, dismissed by authorities but whispered about by the residents. Stories of shadows moving against the grain of normal motion, of chilling screams in the dead of night when no one was supposed to be home. Eva's mind raced as she connected the dots. The building's cursed reputation, the warnings from her elderly neighbor, the strange occurrences in her own apartment, they all pointed to something sinister residing within Elmwood Heights. Determined to uncover the truth, Eva decided to speak with the longest residing tenant of the building, old Mr. Thompson, who lived on the ground floor. Her visit to Mr. Thompson was met with a hesitant welcome. The old man's apartment was cluttered with relics from a bygone era, the air thick with the scent of mildew. "I've seen many come and go," he began, his voice a raspy whisper. "Most don't stay long, not after they sense it." "Sense what?" Eva urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "The darkness," Mr. Thompson replied, glancing nervously towards the dimly lit hallway outside his door. "It's alive, feeding on fear, thriving on the souls it ensnares. This building, it's more than just brick and mortar. It's a beacon, a trap for the unwary." Eva listened, her heart pounding in her chest, as Mr. Thompson recounted tales of the shadow, a formless, malevolent force that roamed the halls at night. It slipped through cracks, under doors, into the dreams of the tenants. According to him, the shadow was the guardian of a terrible secret, a pact made long ago that bound it to the building. Armed with this chilling knowledge, Eva returned to her apartment, more determined than ever to find a way to break the cycle of horror. That night, she set up a camera to capture any abnormal occurrences while she slept. The next morning, she reviewed the footage, her breath catching in her throat as she watched a shadowy figure linger by her bed, its form blurry and shifting unnaturally. Fueled by a mix of terror and resolve, Eva decided to confront the entity. She waited until midnight, the time when the disturbances seemed most potent. Sitting in the darkness of her living room, she spoke into the emptiness, "I know you're here. Show yourself." The air grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through the floor and walls. Then, silence. Eva held her breath, her eyes scanning the darkened room. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to suck the light from the air around it. "I'm not afraid of you," Eva stated, her voice trembling despite her bravado. The shadow shifted, its form blurring and then sharpening. A voice, if it could be called that, emanated from it, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You should be." As Eva faced the shadow, questions raced through her mind. What was the pact? How could it be broken? Was she doomed to become another victim, or was there still a chance to save herself and the other tenants? Determined to find answers, Eva stepped closer to the shadow, her resolve hardening. The air around her crackled with a palpable tension, the outcome of her confrontation uncertain. The shadow loomed larger, and Eva felt the darkness tug at the edges of her soul, a prelude to a battle of wills that was yet to come. Part 3. In the suffocating silence of her apartment, Eva stared into the inky depths of the shadow that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. The whispering voice grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled the room with dread. Many have tried to challenge the darkness, the voices hissed, an amalgam of sorrow and threat woven into their tone. All have become part of it. Eva's mind raced as she considered her next move. Ignoring the churning fear in her gut, she demanded, "What do you want? Why haunt this place?" The shadow's form oscillated, expanding and contracting like a living breath. This building is built upon the foundations of forgotten horrors, ancient wrongs that have seeped into the very mortar. We are bound to it, custodians of despair. Desperate for answers, Eva pushed further. Who made the pact? How can it be broken? Her voice was steady now, emboldened by the shadow's willingness to communicate. A chilling laugh echoed through the room, reverberating against the walls and in the pit of Eva's stomach. The pact was made long before you were born, human. Its architects long dead, its terms lost to time. But know this, the pact feeds on the souls of the living. Only a sacrifice of equal weight can break it. Sacrifice? Eva's voice cracked. The idea of such a thing was abhorrent, but she needed to understand all the same. What kind of sacrifice? Freedom for one demands the entrapment of another, the shadow replied cryptically. It began to dissipate, melting into the walls, its voice trailing into a whisper. Seek the keeper of records. Only through the past can you alter the future. As the shadow vanished, leaving Eva alone in the dim light of her living room, her heart pounded fiercely against her ribcage. She was left with more questions than answers, her mind spinning with the shadow's ominous parting words. The next morning, Eva headed to the city library, determined to dig into the history of Elmwood Heights. The building was more than a century old, its origins murky and records sparse. Hours spent in the dusty archives unearthed a troubling pattern of ownership and a series of tragic events that seemed more than coincidental. Eva discovered that Elmwood Heights was originally built by a reclusive magnate, Cornelius Hargrove, whose wife had died under mysterious circumstances within the building. The newspapers from that time hinted at occult practices, though nothing was ever proven. After Hargrove's own disappearance, the building changed hands multiple times, each owner succumbing to either madness or despair. With this knowledge, Eva visited the local historical society to speak with an expert on the city's old buildings and their legends. Mr. Harrow, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, listened intently to Eva's account. After a long moment of silence, he spoke. Elmwood Heights has always been a blight on this community. Superstition and rumor have clouded its history, but you're not the first to come asking about its shadows. Harrow suggested that Eva look into the Hargrove family archives, which were rumored to contain a private collection of Cornelius's journals and personal documents. Securing access to these would require legal maneuvering and luck, but it seemed the only way to uncover the truth of the pact and how to break it. As night fell, Eva felt the weight of her quest pressing down on her. The shadows in her apartment seemed to watch her, growing longer and more menacing as the hours passed. That night, the scratching at her door returned, louder, more desperate. When she opened it, nothing was there, just the empty, oppressive darkness of the hallway. But the darkness was not empty, it never was. Eyes, countless, hungry eyes, watched her from within the black, and a cold wind whispered threats and promises. As Eva stood there, staring into the void, she realized the gravity of her situation. This was not merely about surviving Elmwood Heights, it was about unearthing and breaking a curse that sought to devour her soul. Resolved but terrified, Eva prepared for what was to come. She knew that delving further into the building's cursed history might provoke the darkness, but the chance to end the cycle of horror was worth the risk. With each step forward, she felt the presence of the shadow growing stronger, its whispers a constant echo in her mind. Eva was no longer just fighting for her own life, but for all those ensnared by the building's malevolent legacy. As she readied herself for the confrontation that was surely coming, Eva understood that the path ahead would be fraught with danger. But she was determined to face whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows of Elmwood Heights. The night grew deeper, the darkness more intense, and in the heart of that darkness, the battle for Eva's soul was just beginning. Part 4. Eva spent the following days immersed in the gritty process of obtaining the Hargrove family archives. Her efforts were met with bureaucratic red tape and skepticism, but her persistence paid off when she was granted access to a sealed section of the city archives. The dusty, forgotten room was filled with old leather-bound journals and cracked leather folios that creaked when opened. It was here, amid these relics, that Eva hoped to find the key to breaking the pact that cursed Elmwood Heights. As she pored over Cornelius Hargrove's journals, Eva discovered a man obsessed with the afterlife and the occult. Entries filled with cryptic symbols and diagrams spoke of his attempts to contact his deceased wife, leading him down a path of dark rituals and pacts with entities he barely understood. One entry, dated just a few weeks before his disappearance, caught Eva's attention. "I have brokered a deal that will ensure our reunion. The shadow will guard the threshold, but its hunger grows with each soul it devours." Eva shuddered, realizing that Cornelius had unwittingly unleashed the shadow in his grief-stricken quest. Further entries detailed a ritual, but the specifics were maddeningly vague, the crucial elements of the pact and its breaking smeared and illegible, as if purposefully obscured. Armed with this fragmented knowledge, Eva returned to Elmwood Heights with a heavy heart. The building seemed to loom larger, more foreboding than ever before. She knew the shadow awaited her, perhaps aware of her discoveries. That night, Eva's sleep was restless, plagued with nightmares of writhing shadows and whispered threats. She awoke to the sound of tapping at her window, a rhythmic, insistent sound that seemed out of place on the 5th floor of an old apartment building. With trepidation, she approached the window, her breath fogging the glass. There, on the other side, was a crow, its eyes unnaturally bright as it tapped the window with its beak. When Eva opened the window, the crow flew in, perching on the back of a chair and cocking its head, as if waiting for her to follow. Eva felt an inexplicable pull to trust the creature, and she followed it as it flew from her apartment and down the hallway. It led her to the basement, a place she had avoided since her last unsettling visit. The air grew colder as she descended, the darkness thickening around her, filled with the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. In the basement, the crow led her to a hidden alcove behind an old, rotting bookshelf. With effort, Eva moved the shelf to reveal a small door, its existence unknown to the current tenants and perhaps forgotten by time itself. The crow fluttered above her head as she opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. With only the light from her phone to guide her, Eva descended. The staircase ended in a cavernous room that felt wholly separate from the world above. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old stone. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, surrounded by arcane symbols etched into the floor. It was here that Cornelius Hargrove had conducted his rituals. As Eva approached the altar, the air shifted, the temperature dropping until her breath became visible. A whisper filled the room, the same chilling voice from her apartment, but stronger now, more corporeal. "You have found the heart of the pact," the shadow hissed as it materialized before her. But knowledge alone cannot break what has been forged in desperation and darkness. Eva faced the shadow, her fear tempered by an urgent need to end the cycle of suffering. "Tell me what I must do," she demanded, her voice echoing off the stone walls. The shadow's form wavered, then expanded, enveloping the room in darkness. "The pact demands a sacrifice of equal value. A soul for a soul. Release one trapped by the pact, and you may take its place. Or find another to bear the burden." Eva's heart raced as she processed the shadow's grim proposal. Was she willing to sacrifice herself or another to save the souls bound to Elmwood Heights? As she contemplated this dire choice, the crow cawed loudly, drawing her attention to a series of inscriptions around the altar that she hadn't noticed before. They spoke of a reversal ritual, one that could potentially free the shadow's hold without the need for a sacrifice. Determined to find another way, Eva studied the inscriptions, her mind working furiously to piece together the fragmented ritual. The shadow watched, its presence a palpable pressure against her psyche. "Beware, human," it whispered. "Some doors, once opened, may never be closed." With each word of the ancient text that Eva deciphered, the air in the room grew heavier, the darkness thicker. She was close to a breakthrough, she could feel it. But as she chanted the first line of the ritual, the ground beneath her trembled, and the walls of the room seemed to groan in protest. Outside, the building stirred, a sense of awakening creeping through its aged bones. The tenants of Elmwood Heights, unaware of the forces at play beneath them, felt a sudden chill, a whisper of fear that caressed the edges of their minds. Eva continued, her voice steady despite the rising chaos around her. The shadow swirled violently, its form stretching towards the ceiling as if in agony or anger. The battle for Elmwood Heights was far from over, and Eva was at its epicenter, her resolve the only light in the encroaching darkness. As the ritual neared its climax, the very fabric of reality seemed to warp within the basement chamber. Eva knew that whatever the outcome, the consequences would be irrevocable. With one final incantation left to speak, she braced herself, ready to face the darkness or be consumed by it. Part 5. The air was electric with unearthly energy as Eva pronounced the final words of the ritual. The symbols around the altar glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The shadow writhed in agony, its form becoming more turbulent, like a storm of pure darkness. Eva felt the pull of its despair and anger, a force so powerful it threatened to tear her spirit apart. "Stop! You know not what you unleash," the shadow roared, its voice a cacophony of pain and rage that vibrated through the very foundations of Elmwood Heights. But Eva, with a resolve forged in the countless hours of fear and determination, pushed through the darkness. "This ends tonight," she shouted back, her voice echoing with the power of the ancient words she had learned. The ground trembled more violently, small cracks appearing in the floor of the cavernous room. From these cracks, a soft, white light began to seep through, contrasting starkly with the oppressive darkness. The shadow, sensing its impending doom, lashed out, its tendrils of darkness sweeping towards Eva in a last desperate attempt to stop her. Eva dodged, feeling the air shift where the dark tendrils passed, the cold touch grazing her. She continued the incantation, her voice now barely a whisper as her strength waned. The white light grew brighter, enveloping the room, pushing back against the darkness. The shadow's form began to disintegrate, its cries of anguish filling the air, a sound so heartrending that Eva nearly faltered. But then, silence fell. The light had consumed the darkness entirely, leaving only the stone altar and the ancient inscriptions glowing gently in the now peaceful chamber. Eva collapsed to the floor, exhausted, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had transpired. As she lay there, Eva realized the building above was silent too. The oppressive feeling that had haunted Elmwood Heights seemed to have lifted, the air lighter, as if a great burden had been removed. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her body sore but her spirit uplifted. She made her way back up the staircase, each step echoing in the now benign darkness. Emerging into the basement of the building, Eva found that the oppressive atmosphere was indeed gone. The air was fresh, as if the building itself had taken a deep cleansing breath. Tentatively, she ascended back to her apartment on the 5th floor. The hallway was just a hallway now, no lingering shadows or whispers. In the light of dawn, Eva stood by her apartment window, looking out over the city as the sun rose, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. She felt a deep sense of peace, a stark contrast to the dread that had filled her nights since she moved in. It seemed that the curse of Elmwood Heights was broken, the building freed from the clutches of the dark pact that had bound it for so long. However, as the city woke below her, a subtle unease prickled at the back of Eva's mind. She pondered the Shadow's final words and the true cost of the ritual. Had she truly freed the building, or had she simply opened the door to something new? This thought lingered as she observed the normalcy of the street below, people going about their morning unaware of the battle that had taken place just hours before. Eva decided to keep the events to herself, fearing that speaking them aloud would somehow reignite the dark forces she had fought so hard to quell. But as she turned away from the window, a small shadow darted across the floor of her apartment, disappearing before she could take a closer look. A chill ran down her spine, a reminder that some doors, once opened, might never be fully closed. She realized then that her fight might not be over after all. The darkness might return, perhaps in other forms, or perhaps it had never left, simply receded into the corners of Elmwood Heights, biding its time. With a newfound resolve, Eva knew she would be ready. She had faced the darkness once and survived. She could do it again. The building might always carry its shadows, but Eva would not let them define her new home. For now, the peace was hers to enjoy, but she would remain vigilant, always watching for the subtle signs that the battle between light and shadow was an eternal one. The sun climbed higher, casting light into her apartment, the shadows receding but never fully disappearing. Eva watched, her eyes wary but her heart steadfast, ready for whatever came next. In the bustling outskirts of a sprawling city, the Marwood Heights apartment complex stood as a monument to urban decay. Once a vibrant community, the complex had fallen into disrepair, its darkened windows and graffiti-strewn walls a stark contrast to the lively streets around it. The city folk whispered about Marwood Heights, spinning tales of mysterious disappearances and eerie happenings that seemed to hover like a dense fog over the dilapidated buildings. The story begins with Elise, a young freelance writer in desperate need of affordable housing. Driven by necessity rather than choice, Elise moved into apartment 304 of Marwood Heights, drawn by the surprisingly low rent and its proximity to the city's creative hub. The apartment, though shabby and worn, held an inexplicable charm with its high ceilings and a large, shadowy balcony that overlooked the inner courtyard of the complex. From the moment she moved in, Elise felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The walls seemed to whisper at night, voices just low enough to elude understanding. She brushed off these experiences as products of her overactive imagination, fueled by the creepy stories she had heard about Marwood Heights. As days turned into weeks, Elise befriended some of the other tenants, Jonah, an elderly man with an encyclopedic knowledge of the building's history, Maya, a reclusive artist who claimed she could communicate with the spirits dwelling in the complex, and Alex, a skeptical college student who laughed off the supernatural stories as urban legends. One night, driven by a blend of curiosity and an upcoming deadline for a horror story, Elise gathered her new friends in her apartment to share tales of what they had experienced. Jonah spoke of the complex's past, a site once used as an asylum during the early 1900s, which was later converted into apartment buildings after a devastating fire claimed the lives of many inmates. Maya shared her eerie paintings, which depicted shadowy figures lurking in the complex's hallways, figures she claimed to have seen with her own eyes. Inspired and somewhat disturbed by these stories, Elise decided to delve deeper into the history of Marwood Heights, visiting the local library to dig through old newspaper archives. There, she discovered a series of articles detailing the mysterious circumstances surrounding the fire, and subsequent reports of disappearances and strange occurrences that began shortly after the buildings were reconstructed. Meanwhile, strange things continued to happen back at Marwood Heights. Residents reported hearing sobbing through the walls at night, sightings of ghostly apparitions in the corridors, and an oppressive feeling of dread that seemed to grow with each passing night. Elise, Jonah, Maya, and Alex, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, formed an unofficial pact to uncover the truth behind the hauntings of Marwood Heights. Their investigation led them to the basement of the complex, a place few had ventured since the conversion. As they navigated the labyrinthine corridors beneath the building, the air grew colder, and the faint whispering Elise had heard in her apartment became a chorus of desperate, anguished voices. The group stumbled upon a hidden room sealed off behind a crumbling wall. Inside, they found remnants of what looked like an old psychiatric ward, rusty bed frames, shackles bolted to the walls, and faded, peeling murals depicting eerily serene landscapes. In the center of the room lay a large, old book, its cover charred but its pages miraculously preserved. The book appeared to be a log or journal, detailing the patients' names and the inhumane treatments they had endured. As Elise flipped through the pages, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they heard the walls around them begin to moan and the floor beneath them tremble. They managed to escape the basement, but the haunting did not stop there. Back in her apartment, Elise felt a chilling certainty that something had followed them from the depths. Her dreams were plagued by visions of the fire, the screams of the trapped and forgotten, and a shadowy figure that beckoned her back to the basement. The group realized that they had disturbed something malevolent, something that perhaps should have never been disturbed. As the hauntings intensified, each member of the group started experiencing personal nightmares manifesting in their waking lives. Maya painted frenzied scenes of the fire as if driven by an unseen force, her hands moving against her will. Jonah's knowledge turned into obsession as he barricaded himself in his apartment, poring over old texts and muttering about a way to close the gateway. Alex, once skeptical, was now tormented by unexplainable physical ailments that doctors could not diagnose. Elise, determined not to succumb to the horrors of Marwood Heights, decided to confront the shadowy figure from her dreams. Armed with the old asylum log as a guide, she planned to venture once more into the basement, believing that understanding the past might help them confront and possibly quell the restless spirits. The night before they planned to return to the basement, Elise dreamt of a young woman named Sarah, one of the asylum's former patients whose tragic story was detailed in the log. In the dream, Sarah led Elise through the charred remains of the old asylum, her voice a whisper barely audible over the crackling flames. She spoke of a hidden vault beneath the basement, where the darkest experiments had been conducted and where her body had been unceremoniously left to decay. With each step, the air grew hotter, and the screams of the invisible damned rose around them. Sarah's presence, though ghostly, felt like a beacon of sorrow and rage, guiding Elise towards a horrifying truth hidden in the depths of Marwood Heights. The next day, Elise shared her vision with the group. They gathered their courage, along with tools to break through any physical barriers they might encounter. The basement was even colder than before, the air thick with a sense of impending dread. The whispers were now clear, desperate voices begging for release or screaming for vengeance. The group moved through the darkness, their flashlights casting long, ominous shadows against the damp walls. They found the sealed vault Sarah had shown Elise in the dream. It took hours to break through the old, rusted locks and reinforced door. Inside, they discovered a smaller, more secure chamber, its walls lined with ancient, dust-covered files and dark stains that spoke of unspeakable acts. At the center of the room was a pit, a shallow grave where numerous skeletons lay intertwined, their bones marked with signs of severe trauma. The air in the vault was suffocating, heavy with the despair of souls long trapped within its confines. As they documented their findings, hoping to bring some form of justice to those lost, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath became visible, and the lights flickered as if the energy in the room was being drained. The shadows seemed to move independently, swirling around the room, tightening around them like a noose. Jonah, his voice trembling, recited passages from an old text he believed could contain the restless spirits. Maya, her eyes wide with terror, sketched the scene, her drawings becoming more frantic as the shadows grew darker. Alex, once a disbeliever, clutched a crucifix, the skepticism washed away by undeniable fear. Elise, feeling a strange pull towards the pit, approached it as if drawn by an unseen hand. She could hear Sarah's voice, now a pained echo, urging her to look deeper. As she peered into the abyss, the bones seemed to stir, a low moan emanating from the earth itself. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and a cold gust rushed up from the pit, enveloping her in a chilling embrace. The group felt a presence then, more potent and terrifying than any ghostly apparition. It was an ancient, vengeful force, unleashed by their intrusion, and now free to roam the halls of Marwood Heights. The lights died completely, plunging them into darkness as the voices crescendoed into a deafening roar. In the pitch black, they fled, guided by the faint, flickering light from Jonah's failing flashlight. The buildings seemed to come alive around them, walls cracking, floors heaving, and the air filled with the sound of something vast and angry stirring in the depths. They barely made it out of the basement, the door slamming shut with a force that echoed like a gunshot. Back in their respective apartments, each member of the group was left to grapple with what they had experienced. The building was no longer just a place of eerie stories and minor spectral occurrences. It had become a gateway to something profoundly dark and powerful. The residents of Marwood Heights, once oblivious or mildly amused by the tales, now found themselves living in a palpable state of fear. The hauntings became more aggressive, physical manifestations occurring with terrifying regularity, and the building itself seemed to deteriorate at an accelerated pace. Elise, her resolve hardened by the horrors she had witnessed, knew that this was only the beginning. They had stirred something that could not be easily quelled or contained. As she lay in bed that night, the whispering shadows creeping along the edges of her room, she realized that the true battle for Marwood Heights was just beginning. The secrets of the asylum, the tortured souls of its forgotten patients, and the dark force they had unleashed were now intricately woven into the fabric of the building, each shadow filled with a story, each whisper a warning. The story of Marwood Heights was far from over, and its darkest chapters were yet to be written. As the hauntings of Marwood Heights escalated, the bonds among Elise, Jonah, Maya, and Alex grew stronger, bound together by the terror they had witnessed and the unresolved mysteries that lingered in the air like the stale smell of decay. Each night brought new horrors, inexplicable noises that echoed through the hallways, doors slamming shut without reason, and chilling glimpses of ghostly figures that vanished when approached. Elise, her nights plagued by restless sleep and disturbing visions, began to document everything. Her apartment turned into a makeshift command center, walls plastered with historical records, photographs of the asylum, and Maya's eerie artwork. Among the chaos of her research, one pattern emerged. Sarah's story was central to the haunting. Her spirit, tortured and unavenged, seemed to be the catalyst for the malevolence that had overtaken the building. Determined to find closure for Sarah and peace for Marwood Heights, Elise proposed a daring plan. They would hold a seance in the basement, at the heart of the old asylum, to attempt communication with Sarah's spirit directly. Perhaps by understanding her pain and helping her find peace, they might also calm the other restless spirits. The night of the seance arrived, laden with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The four gathered in the basement, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of candles placed in a circle around them. Jonah, who had brought an old tome of rituals he claimed could protect them, painted symbols around the perimeter with salt and ash. Maya set up her canvases, ready to capture whatever visions might come. Alex, though still harboring doubts, held onto his crucifix, a silent prayer on his lips. As the clock struck midnight, Elise began the seance, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Sarah, we call upon you," she intoned, "reveal yourself to us and share your story. We seek to understand and to help." The candles flickered as if caught in a sudden breeze, and the temperature dropped sharply. A palpable presence filled the room, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Then, a figure slowly materialized in the center of their circle, Sarah, her form spectral but distinctly pained, her eyes hollow with decades of suffering. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was a mere whisper, yet it bore the weight of unbearable agony. "Free us," she pleaded, "end our torment." She recounted the horrors she had endured, the experiments that had twisted and broken her both physically and mentally, and her death, lonely and unmourned in the dark confines of the basement. The room shook as she spoke, walls groaning under the strain of her sorrow. Maya's brushes moved furiously, guided by an unseen force, capturing Sarah's visage and the emotional storms surrounding her. Jonah recited incantations, his voice rising over Sarah's whispers, seeking to strengthen the protective barrier he had created. Elise, driven by a mix of fear and compassion, reached out her hand towards Sarah, an offer of solace. As she did, a sudden surge of energy swept through the basement. The candles snuffed out, plunging them into darkness, and a scream echoed through the complex, a cacophony of every soul lost to the asylum's cruelty. When the lights returned, Sarah's spirit had vanished, but the air felt lighter, as if a part of the darkness had lifted. However, the peace was short-lived. The building itself began to react, walls cracking and floors shifting as if the structure was coming alive. The group barely escaped the basement as the door slammed shut with an ominous finality, the echo of Sarah's last word, "Free us," lingering in their ears. Back in her apartment, Elise felt a deep unrest stirring within her. The seance had provided some answers, but had also unleashed new forces. She realized that Sarah's spirit was not the only one trapped in Marwood Heights. The asylum had been a place of profound suffering for many, and their spirits were intertwined with the building's very essence. As the days passed, the hauntings grew more intense. Residents began to leave, driven away by the relentless supernatural disturbances. But Elise, Jonah, Maya, and Alex could not leave. They felt a responsibility to those trapped spirits, a need to restore peace not just to the building but to the souls intertwined with it. The group delved deeper into the history of the asylum, uncovering names and stories of other patients who had suffered within its walls. Each name added to their understanding and also to their burden. The hauntings became more personal, each spirit seeking acknowledgement and release. As they prepared for what they knew would be a long and arduous journey, Elise recorded every detail, her blog now a diary of the haunting of Marwood Heights. Each post ended with a call to those who might help, to those who had experienced similar hauntings, to come forward. The story of Marwood Heights was far from over, it was just the beginning of a deeper, darker exploration into the supernatural forces at play. In the ensuing weeks, Elise and her friends faced increasing challenges. The building seemed to have a mind of its own, with doors that would lock and unlock mysteriously, elevators operating independently, and windows that would shatter without any impact. The electricity would flicker erratically, casting the hallways into darkness without warning, only to reveal fleeting glimpses of apparitions standing in the shadows when the lights returned. As the situation escalated, the group's efforts became more desperate. They sought out experts in paranormal activity, historians knowledgeable about the building's grim past, and even psychics who might communicate further with the spirits. Each visitor brought new insights, but also new dangers, as if their attempts to communicate were provoking the spirits to greater displays of power. One night, while researching in the public library, Elise found a forgotten manuscript buried in the archives. It was the personal diary of Dr. Aldous Hargrave, the head of the asylum during its darkest years. The diary revealed chilling details about the experiments conducted on the patients, driven by Hargrave's belief in supernatural capabilities of the human mind. His notes suggested that he was attempting to create a conduit between the living and the dead, using the patients as unwilling participants in his horrific trials. The diary also hinted at the existence of a hidden chamber within the asylum where Hargrave carried out his most secret experiments. This room, according to the diary, contained an artifact of unknown origin, described only as the key to the veil. Hargrave believed this artifact was essential to his work, a tool to permanently open a gateway to the spirit world. Armed with this new information, the group decided to search for the hidden chamber. They scoured the basement, now familiar with its chilling atmosphere, and after several tense days of searching, they discovered a concealed door behind an old filing cabinet in Hargrave's abandoned office. The hidden chamber was a small, claustrophobic room with walls lined with archaic symbols. At its center stood a pedestal holding an ancient, metallic object adorned with intricate engravings and faintly glowing symbols. The air around it shimmered with a spectral light, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they approached. As soon as Elise touched the artifact, a surge of visions overwhelmed her. She saw the asylum in its early days, the patients suffering under Hargrave's cruel experiments, and the spirit's anguished entrapment within the walls of Marwood Heights. She also saw Hargrave himself, his descent into madness as he became consumed by his quest to breach the boundaries of life and death. The group realized that the artifact was the source of the hauntings, the anchor keeping the spirits bound to the physical world. They debated what to do with it: destroy it, remove it from the building, or use it to attempt to free the spirits. Each option carried significant risks, and they feared that the wrong choice could exacerbate the hauntings or even unleash something far worse. Meanwhile, the disturbances in Marwood Heights reached a new intensity. Objects flew through the air with violent force, injuring residents and scaring away most of the remaining tenants. The building's infrastructure began to deteriorate rapidly, with water pipes bursting and electrical fires breaking out spontaneously. It became clear that whatever they were going to do, they needed to act quickly. As they prepared to make a decision about the artifact, Elise's blog attracted the attention of a mysterious figure, a descendant of one of the original architects of the asylum. This person claimed to have knowledge of the building's esoteric design and its purpose as a psychic prison designed to contain the spirits harnessed by Hargrave's experiments. With this new ally, Elise and her friends planned a final confrontation with the forces within Marwood Heights. They would use the artifact in a ritual designed to either seal away the spirits forever or release them from their torment. As they gathered in the hidden chamber, setting up their equipment and preparing their minds for the ordeal ahead, they were unaware of the true magnitude of the forces they were about to confront. The ritual began at midnight, under a blood-red moon, the air crackling with electric tension. As they activated the artifact, the building shook violently, as if an earthquake had struck its very foundations. The walls of the chamber vibrated with an eerie hum, and the symbols began to glow with a fierce, otherworldly light. Outside, the night sky turned a deep, ominous shade of crimson, and the ground beneath Marwood Heights tremored with growing intensity. Inside, the spirits swirled around them, their faces twisted in expressions of both hope and despair, caught in the flux between this world and the next. The power unleashed was more terrifying and beautiful than anything they could have imagined, a whirlwind of souls and memories colliding with the physical reality of Marwood Heights. The building itself seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting like the chest of a gigantic beast. The air was thick with a chorus of whispers, each voice a thread in the tapestry of the asylum's dark history. As the ritual intensified, the group found themselves standing at the threshold between life and death, reality blurring around them. The artifact, now fully activated, pulsed with a life of its own, its glow illuminating the chamber in stark, surreal light. The symbols on the walls seemed to move, twisting and turning in a dance of ancient power. Elise, her mind linked to the artifact through a cascade of visions, witnessed the myriad lives that had been twisted and broken within the asylum's walls. She saw the spirits not as mere echoes of suffering, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and fears, all extinguished by Hargrave's merciless pursuit of knowledge. She felt their pain, their longing for release, and their rage against the man who had doomed them to eternal unrest. The physical strain on the group was immense. Jonah, chanting incantations to bolster their defense, struggled to maintain the barrier as malevolent forces pounded against their protections like waves against a cliff. Maya, her eyes wide with fear and awe, continued to sketch frantically, her drawings becoming more abstract and chaotic, as if trying to capture the essence of the supernatural storms surrounding them. Alex, despite his initial skepticism, became a pillar of strength for the group, his faith providing a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. He supported Elise, whose connection to the artifact seemed to be draining her life force, her face pale and her body trembling. The chamber's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, the air so heavy it was hard to breathe. The walls began to bleed, a slow drip of black, viscous fluid that pooled on the floor and reflected the flickering light in unsettling patterns. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of anger, pleading, and sorrow that filled the room with a tangible sense of despair. Amidst this chaos, the mysterious figure who had contacted Elise through her blog revealed themselves as Cassandra, the great-granddaughter of one of the asylum's original architects. She brought with her ancient documents and blueprints that contained hidden symbols and phrases which could strengthen the ritual. With her knowledge, they adjusted their approach, redirecting the energy of the artifact to not just release the spirits but also to repair the psychic wounds left in the fabric of the building. As they adjusted the ritual, the building itself reacted violently. The ground shook, cracks spreading across the floor and climbing up the walls like creeping vines. From these fissures, a bluish light emanated, a visual manifestation of the psychic energy trapped within the building. The spirits, sensing the shift in energy, began to converge on the chamber. They formed a spectral vortex above the artifact, their forms blurring and merging into a swirling maelstrom of light and shadow. The group stood hand in hand, united in their purpose, as they channeled their combined energies into the ritual. Elise, acting as the conduit, felt an overwhelming rush of emotions and memories flood through her. She saw the asylum through the eyes of its inmates, felt their confusion and fear, their pain, and ultimately their burning desire for peace. She spoke to them, her voice echoing in the chamber, promising release and rest. As the ritual reached its climax, the artifact emitted a blinding light, and a shockwave of energy rippled through Marwood Heights. The building groaned, a sound like the lament of a dying giant, as the spirits began to dissipate, their forms melting away into the light, their whispers fading into silence. The group, exhausted but elated, watched as the last of the light dimmed and the chamber settled into quiet darkness. They had done it, they had freed the spirits and potentially cleansed Marwood Heights of its haunting. But as they made their way out of the basement, they realized that the true extent of their actions was yet unknown. The building was eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by a tentative calm. But as they stepped outside, they noticed something unsettling. The night sky still held a residual crimson hue, and the air carried a static charge that made their skin tingle. In the days that followed, Marwood Heights seemed transformed. The residents who chose to stay reported a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. However, strange occurrences still happened, albeit less frequently and less violently. It was as if the building was settling, adjusting to its new reality. Elise continued to document everything, her blog becoming a record of their extraordinary experience. But deep down, she knew that the story of Marwood Heights was not yet complete. There were still unanswered questions, shadows in the corners that seemed to watch and wait. As the group gathered one evening to discuss their next steps, they realized that their journey into the supernatural was far from over. They had opened a door they could not easily close, and the boundaries they had crossed whispered of deeper mysteries and darker realms yet to be explored. The artifact, though it had served its purpose, still held secrets, its origins and full capabilities unknown. Cassandra, with her knowledge of arcane architecture, suspected that the artifact was only a key to larger, more potent forces that could exist beyond the veil of their reality. The night air was tense as they gathered in Elisa's apartment, the walls now stripped of their haunted history but lined with new maps and notes, plotting their next foray into the unknown. As they discussed their plans, a sudden chill swept through the room, a reminder that while they had changed Marwood Heights, they had also changed themselves, becoming beacons for supernatural forces. Jonah, his voice grave, pointed out that they had meddled with powers that humans were not meant to control. Maya, her recent drawings darker and more complex, shared visions of other places, other keys like the artifact, scattered across the globe, each associated with its own legion of spirits and stories. Alex, now a firm believer in the supernatural, suggested they prepare for whatever might come next, proposing they study more about spiritual protection and containment. The group agreed that they needed to learn more about the forces they had unleashed. Cassandra brought out the ancient blueprints once more, tracing lines that formed patterns and symbols they hadn't noticed before. These symbols matched some of the engravings on the artifact, suggesting that there were more connections to be made, more secrets to uncover. As the night deepened, the wind outside grew stronger, the windows rattling as if in warning. Elise felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She glanced around, half expecting to see Sarah's spectral form in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the feeling that something unseen lingered just out of sight. Determined to protect themselves and uncover the truth, the group formed a plan to travel, to follow the map Cassandra had pieced together from the old blueprints and the symbols on the artifact. Each location promised answers but also hinted at dangers far greater than any they had faced at Marwood Heights. As they made preparations, Elise continued to document their experiences. Her blog posts were now followed by thousands, her readers drawn into the mystery and horror of their journey. She wrote not just to share their story but to warn others of the thinning veils between worlds, the shadows that moved when thought unwatched, and the doors that could be opened but might never be closed. The final night before their departure, the group met once more in the basement of Marwood Heights, the site of their most harrowing and transformative experience. They set up a circle of protection, a simple ritual to safeguard their journey. But as they chanted together, the air around them grew oppressive, the shadows deepening. Suddenly, the candles flickered out, one by one, as a deep, resonant hum filled the room. The ground trembled, and a fissure cracked open in the floor of the basement, a stark, gaping wound in the earth. From the fissure, a bluish light glowed, casting an otherworldly illumination. The air pulsed with power, and a voice, ancient and indescribable, echoed through the chamber. Its words felt more than heard. "You have opened the gate. Walk now the paths of shadow, but beware the depths of the beyond." The group stood frozen, the magnitude of their undertaking settling in. They were no longer merely investigators of a haunted apartment complex. They had become participants in a cosmic play, a battle of forces beyond their understanding. As they left the basement, stepping out into the cool, early morning air, the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. But the horizon was not clear, it was streaked with crimson, the color of blood, of a warning. Elise looked back at Marwood Heights, its structure silent and imposing against the waking sky. She knew they were leaving much behind, but they were also moving towards something unimaginable. The story of Marwood Heights was just one chapter in a much larger saga, a narrative threaded through the very fabric of reality. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but it held the promise of truths too compelling to ignore. And so, with the weight of their past experiences anchoring them and the thrill of unknown adventures calling them forward, Elise and her friends stepped into the burgeoning daylight, their futures intertwined with the shadows they sought to understand, the boundaries of their world forever blurred. The end was not an end, but a beginning, a doorway to the infinite and the unknown.